So if you're questioning the past and you're wondering why, time to check out History High.
What do Beyonce, Jay-Z and Drake have to do with the Cuban Missile Crisis? Hopefully, by the end of this video, you'll be able to answer that question. Welcome to History High. This video looks at the causes, features and consequences of the Cuban Missile Crisis and is aimed at GCSE students. The causes of the Cuban Missile Crisis can be split into three main areas: the Cuban Revolution, the Bay of Pigs incident, and American missiles in Turkey. Although history is definitely the most important subject at school, it might help you to remember this as CBA. Cuban Revolution. In January 1959, a group of revolutionaries led by Fidel Castro and Che Guevara overthrew the American-backed dictator in Cuba. America owned lots of the land and businesses in Cuba and was an important investor in Cuba's main export, sugar. So this revolution really worried the American president, Eisenhower. In May 1959, the new leader, Fidel Castro, took over all the land in Cuba owned by foreigners. Castro even paid compensation, but the US refused to accept it, so Castro took the land anyway. In February 1960, the Soviet Union agreed to buy Cuban sugar and give arms to Cuba. As Cuba became friendlier with the Soviet Union, this raised tensions with the US, as Cuba is only 90 miles from the coast of Florida. The second cause of the Cuban Missile Crisis was the Bay of Pigs incident. This was when America, under JFK now, agreed to train and support Cuban exiles who wanted to overthrow Castro. On the 17th of April 1961, 1,400 Cuban exiles landed in the Bay of Pigs in Cuba. They were met by 20,000 soldiers ready to fight them off. The invasion was a total disaster and humiliating for America. It made Cuba look to the USSR for even more support, and in December 1961, Castro finally declared himself a communist. The final major cause of the missile crisis was that in April 1962, America put Jupiter intermediate range ballistic missiles into Turkey. The missiles could hit Moscow. This increased tensions again and made Khrushchev want to install missiles near the US. Cuba was ideal. Okay, so what was the Cuban Missile Crisis? The crisis was the culmination of all these rising tensions of the past few years. It really began on the 14th of October 1962, when an American U-2 spy plane took pictures of launch pads for medium-range ballistic missiles in Cuba. You should be able to see this famous photo on the screen. The CIA then told Kennedy that Soviet ships were sailing to Cuba carrying the missiles for these launch pads. Faced with this terrifying information, Kennedy felt that he had three choices. He could invade Cuba, as that had failed at the Bay of Pigs. He could bomb the missile sites in Cuba, or he could sink the Soviet ships as they approached Cuba. On the 16th of October, Kennedy met with his executive committee, ExComm as they were known, to discuss what to do. They met every day from the 16th to the 28th of October, and these 13 days became known as, well, the 13 days. This is the closest the world has ever come to nuclear war. I've put the key dates of these 13 days on the screen. I'm not going to go through this in detail, so you might want to pause the video now and jot these down. By the end of the 13 days, Khrushchev agreed to remove Soviet missiles publicly from Cuba. In return, the US agreed to remove missiles from Turkey, but only secretly. This made Khrushchev look really weak and JFK looked strong. Khrushchev was eventually forced out as Soviet leader in 1964. And finally, what were the consequences of this world-changing event? The consequences can be divided into short-term and long-term. If you struggle to remember all of these, pick two to focus on. Short-term, direct communication was set up between Washington and Moscow in June 1963. This became known as the Hotline. In August 1963, a test ban treaty was signed by the US, Britain, and the Soviet Union. This banned testing nuclear weapons in space and underwater, and this was an important step in controlling nuclear weapons. Longer term, in 1967, the Outer Space Treaty was signed. In this treaty, the USA and USSR agreed not to use space for military purposes. And in 1968, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was signed, where countries agreed not to share their nuclear technology with other countries. All of these consequences led to the period of détente, relaxation in tensions, which is the subject of another video. So, to summarise, 3 causes of the Cuban Missile Crisis: the Cuban Revolution, the Bay of Pigs invasion, and American missiles in Turkey. Remember this as CBA. Key features of the Cuban Missile Crisis include the 13 days of tension and then the final agreement to remove missiles from Cuba and Turkey. And 4 key consequences of the Cuban Missile Crisis: short term, the Hotline and Test Ban Treaty, and long term, the Outer Space Treaty and Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So, did you guess the link between Beyoncé, Jay-Z, Drake and the Cuban Missile Crisis? Well, Beyoncé and Jay-Z visited Cuba in 2014 and it was really controversial. To this day, because of the history that we've talked about, it's still difficult for Americans to visit Cuba. And Trump has recently tightened the US embargo on Cuba even more. So what connects Drake to Cuba? Well, if you ever get a question about consequences of the Cuban Missile Crisis, you must talk about that thing that gave Drake so much stress: the hotline. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to the History High channel. Thank you for listening.
So if you're questioning the past and you're wondering why, time to check out History